The village of St. Mary's Hollow, nestled in the heart of the English countryside, was one of those rare places where time seemed to stand still. The cobbled streets, the ivy-clad cottages, and the scent of fresh-baked bread drifting from the local bakery all conspired to create a timeless charm. The residents, mostly elderly with a few younger families sprinkled in, moved with the ease and rhythm of a tight-knit community. It was the sort of village where everyone knew everyone, and secrets, if there were any, were well kept. It was on this crisp autumn afternoon that the harvest tea was held in the village hall, an event that had become as much a part of the community's fabric as the old oak tree in the square. The hall, a quaint building with its honey-colored stone walls and arched windows, was adorned with strings of dried flowers and wreaths of wheat. The tables were spread with plates of freshly baked scones, clotted cream, and dainty finger sandwiches, and a large pot of Earl Grey tea steamed in the center of each table. Villagers mingled, their voices a pleasant hum as they laughed and chatted, swapping gossip and news from the village and beyond. Miss Marple, as usual, sat in her favorite chair by the fire, a spot she had claimed years ago and never relinquished. The leather armchair, worn smooth with age, was positioned perfectly to catch the warmth of the flames. She sat there now with a woolen scarf draped across her lap, her knitting needles moving in practiced rhythm as she added another row to the scarf she had been working on for weeks. Her knitting, like her mind, moved steadily, never rushed, yet always purposeful. She took little notice of the ongoing chatter around her, her sharp eyes observing everything in the room, noting the way people moved, the subtle shifts in body language, the fleeting glances exchanged between strangers. As she knitted, her mind wandered briefly to the newcomer in the village, Charles Grafton. He had moved into the old Bramley house, at the edge of the village just a few weeks prior, and ever since, he had become the topic of much speculation. Tall, dark-haired, and dressed in clothes that spoke of someone used to the finer things in life, he was a sharp contrast to the modest villagers who surrounded him. Yet, there was something about him that intrigued Miss Marple, something just a little too polished, too self-assured to be entirely trustworthy. She had seen people like him before, men who arrived in small villages, carrying with them a quiet but undeniable aura of mystery. Today he had arrived with the same smooth charm, slipping in almost unnoticed among the other guests. Miss Marple observed him as he moved through the room, engaging in polite conversation with various villagers. His attention, however, seemed to linger most on young Margaret Dell, the local schoolteacher. Miss Marple noted how Grafton's gaze followed Margaret's every movement, his eyes lingering just a moment too long when she spoke to him. There was no obvious sign of affection, yet the connection was undeniable, and Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her there was more to their interaction than met the eye. But before Miss Marple could reflect further on the subtle exchange, a sudden commotion broke out across the room. Mrs. Richardson, the village's ever-flustered and dramatic chairwoman, entered the hall carrying a tray of teacups. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she stumbled toward Miss Marple. "Mrs. Richardson, whatever is the matter?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. She set aside her knitting and gave the woman her full attention. Mrs. Richardson's lips quivered and she swallowed hard, her eyes wide with panic. It's Mr. Grafton," she gasped, her voice trembling. He's dead." The words seemed to hang in the air like the last echo of a distant thunderstorm. For a moment, the room fell into stunned silence. Then a flurry of murmurs erupted, each person eager to share their own theory. Dead? How? Mrs. Watkins, the baker's wife, was the first to speak up, her face reddening with shock. "Heart attack, I say," chimed in Miss Pettigrew, the librarian, adjusting her round spectacles. "He was always so tense, don't you think? So high-strung. It must have been too much for him." No, Mrs. Richardson interrupted, wringing her hands in distress. "I don't know what happened exactly, but I found him in the chair by the fire, slumped over, cold as stone. No sign of life. Not a breath, not a movement. He's gone." At this, the room seemed to hold its breath and the conversation shifted in hushed tones. Eyes turned to the corner of the room where the large armchair by the fire sat vacant. It was the very chair Miss Marple had been watching from. The spot was always warm, the light from the fire casting long shadows across the floor. The police, led by Constable Foster, arrived shortly after the news spread. But the investigation that followed seemed, at first, to be nothing more than a formality. Mr. Grafton's body was removed with little ceremony, the guests were ushered out of the Izar Hall, and the villagers returned to their homes, each processing the event in their own way. But Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, stayed behind, her mind already piecing together the details of what had just transpired. The village reacts. Gossip spreads. The next day, St. Mary's Hollow was alive with gossip. Whispers fluttered from one cottage to the next, as the villagers gathered in small groups to discuss the death of Charles Grafton. No one knew much about him, and it seemed that everyone had their own theory about why he had died and who might have been involved. "I heard he had a terrible row with Margaret just last week," Mrs. Watkins said, her voice lowered as if confiding a great secret. "She looked so upset afterward, poor thing. I knew something was off about him." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Pettigrew retorted, her nose wrinkling in disdain. "I'm sure it's nothing like that. He was simply too high-strung for the village. A man like him couldn't possibly be happy here." But it was Mrs. Richardson who seemed most affected by the event, having found Mr. Grafton's body. She seemed to have lost all sense of propriety, her usual airs of control gone, replaced by a frantic energy that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. It was clear to Miss Marple that Mrs. Richardson was hiding something, though what it was, she couldn't yet say. There was a nervousness in her behavior, a furtive glance that suggested she was concealing more than the village knew. Early investigation. Miss Marple's quiet observation. The investigation began as soon as the constable arrived. Mr. Foster, a well-meaning but somewhat incompetent officer, immediately began questioning the villagers, eager to wrap the whole affair up and move on. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, noted several things that the constable overlooked. For one, the chair by the fire where Mr. Grafton had been found was unusually disheveled. The back of the chair was slightly askew, as if someone had hurriedly left it or been pushed away. Miss Marple examined it closely. She noted the faint scent of tobacco in the air near the chair. Grafton hadn't been a smoker, at least not publicly. But the smell was there, unmistakable. It was faint, like a shadow of something hidden. Furthermore, Miss Marple observed the position of the chair itself. It was positioned too far from the hearth, as though it had been moved to a different spot. The carpet beneath the chair was slightly indented, as if someone had been sitting there for a long time, shifting uncomfortably. Miss Marple knew that in every murder there were always small, telling details that others missed. It was often these details, the things that seemed out of place, insignificant even, that led to the truth. And already she could sense that there was more to Mr. Grafton's death than the villagers realized. This was only the beginning, Miss Marple thought. The game had begun, and the true story behind the death of Charles Grafton was yet to unfold. The clues were there, hidden in plain sight, and it was only a matter of time before they would lead her to the truth. The following day, St. Mary's Hollow was abuzz with gossip. In every corner of the village, behind curtains and through garden gates, the air was thick with speculation. The death of Charles Grafton had shaken the community to its core, but it was also a source of fascination. The fact that someone so new, so mysterious, could be snuffed out so suddenly only added to the intrigue. It wasn't just his death that stirred the village. It was the fact that no one truly knew who Charles Grafton was. By the time the sun had fully risen, the village was alive with murmurs. "I heard he was having an affair," Mrs. Watkins, the baker's wife, whispered to Mrs. Pelham, the seamstress, as they stood near the window of the bakery. "With that young teacher, Margaret Dell. You saw the way he looked at her, didn't you? They had a row last week, I heard." Mrs. Pelham, who was known for her sharp observations, raised her eyebrows and pursed her lips. "Nonsense. He was just a man with too many secrets. I've always said people who come from the city carry their shadows with them." Others in the village were less speculative, more interested in practical matters. Old Mr. Collingwood, the retired solicitor, and his wife had spent the evening puzzling over the details. "Poor woman," Mr. Collingwood murmured as he sipped his tea. Mrs. Richardson must have been beside herself finding him in that state. I doubt she'll sleep for weeks, poor thing. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite spot by the fire, was an ever-present figure as she listened to the gossip unfold. The warmth from the hearth was comforting, but her mind was sharp, constantly working. She had heard it all, the suspicions, the whispers, the wild assumptions, but none of it held water in her mind. She needed more than rumors. She needed facts. The village hall, where the tea had been held the day before, had become the unofficial center for these discussions. Everyone who had attended the tea now seemed to have a theory. Some thought it was the stress of village life that had finally gotten to Grafton, while others were already whispering about the scandal with Margaret Dell. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple quietly observed, letting the villagers' chatter wash over her without becoming part of it. She had learned long ago that the most important clues often lay in the most subtle moments. The way someone shifted uncomfortably when speaking, or the way they avoided making eye contact when asked about certain things. These were the signals that mattered most. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Mrs. Richardson. The chairwoman had been the one to discover Grafton's body, and though her outward composure had been shaky, there was something more unsettling beneath her nervousness. The woman had been acting in a way that was too frantic to be entirely genuine. It was as though she had witnessed something, or perhaps had known something, that she was unwilling to share. Miss Marple had noted her hesitancy when asked questions by the constable, and that discomfort lingered in her mind. Early investigation. Miss Marple's quiet observation constable Foster was the first to lead the charge in investigating the mysterious death of Charles Grafton. His uniform was neatly pressed, his hair combed into a tidy part, but there was an unmistakable hint of nervousness in his posture. He had been the constable in St. Mary's Hollow for nearly 5 years, and while the job was typically uneventful, a death of this magnitude was entirely new territory for him. He was doing his best to keep a composed demeanor, but his unease was palpable to anyone watching. The constable began by questioning the villagers who had been present at the harvest tea. They had all seen Charles Grafton shortly before the discovery of his body, but no one had noticed anything unusual at the time. Everyone who had spoken with him described him as polite and charming, if somewhat distant. Mrs. Richardson, who had discovered the body, was particularly shaken, having stumbled upon him in his chair by the fire. The question that hung in the air, unasked by the constable but not missed by Miss Marple, was, why had Grafton been seated so far from the warmth of the hearth, away from the rest of the group? He was, after all, a man of refinement, used to comfort. There had been something about his positioning in that chair that didn't sit quite right. The constable took careful notes as the villagers spoke, their voices echoing off the walls of the hall. Margaret Dell, the schoolteacher, was questioned last. She had seemed quiet, almost withdrawn since the news of Grafton's death had spread. Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the way Margaret's eyes darted nervously when asked about her relationship with Grafton. Margaret had insisted that she and Grafton were only acquaintances, and that they had not been particularly close. Yet Miss Marple, ever observant, had seen the fleeting sadness in the young woman's eyes, the tightness in her jaw, and the way her fingers clenched at the edge of her dress. It was as though there was something she wasn't telling. "Miss Dell," Constable Foster said, his voice firm but gentle, "did Mr. Grafton ever give you any reason to believe he was in danger? Was there anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Margaret hesitated. Her lips trembled slightly before she spoke. "No, I don't believe so. He was a private man, and sometimes people just want to be left alone, you know." Miss Marple watched Margaret closely, her keen eyes noting the shift in the girl's demeanor. It was subtle, but it was there. The way she glanced down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, spoke volumes. Something was not being said, and Miss Marple suspected that Margaret held the key to unlocking the mystery. A hidden clue, the chair and the smell of tobacco. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back at the village hall, now empty except for a few stragglers. The fire had died down, the room now dimmer than it had been during the tea. But the chair where Grafton had been found still stood in the same spot, as if frozen in time. Miss Marple moved toward it slowly, her eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. The chair, the very seat Grafton had occupied, seemed to hold the answers, if only she could interpret the signs correctly. She leaned over, examining the spot where Grafton had slumped over. Her sharp eyes immediately caught a faint discoloration on the fabric of the armchair. It wasn't much, just a small, barely noticeable stain on the upholstery near the armrest. Miss Marple pressed her fingers gently to the fabric, feeling for any sign of moisture. There was none, but the stain was odd. It seemed too deliberate, too out of place. Perhaps a bit of spilled drink, but not from Grafton's hand. The stain was positioned as though it had been made by something resting against the armrest, a mere touch, the kind that might come from a coat sleeve or, Miss Marple's thoughts paused, perhaps something else entirely. As Miss Marple's mind worked through the possibilities, she suddenly caught a faint smell in the air, barely perceptible but distinct. It was the unmistakable scent of tobacco, that slightly bitter, smoky aroma. She straightened, looking around the room. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to linger just near the chair where Grafton had been found. It was a curious thing. Grafton had not been known to smoke, at least not openly. But the smell was unmistakable, and it was stronger, here than anywhere else in the room. This was no coincidence. Miss Marple was sure of it. Miss Marple's thoughts continued to race as she returned to her seat by the fire, watching the flickering flames. There were more questions than answers, and as the evening wore on, the village continued to buzz with theories and suspicions. Yet Miss Marple had already begun to piece together the subtle details others had missed. There was something beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward death, and it was only a matter of time before it all began to come together. Her quiet observations were beginning to show the first glimmers of truth. But the real puzzle had yet to be solved. The morning after the discovery of Charles Grafton's death, the village of St. Mary's Hollow remained steeped in a strange mixture of shock and curiosity. The normally serene streets seemed to hum with whispers, and the air was thick with unanswered questions. At the heart of the village, however, the atmosphere was quieter. It had all unfolded too suddenly, and no one seemed entirely ready to confront the reality of the situation. Miss Marple, as ever, was calm amidst the storm. She had spent the previous night in quiet reflection, her mind sifting through the clues that had already begun to form. Her eyes had caught many details that others might have missed, small, fleeting things that had already set her on a path of careful observation. While the rest of the village engaged in idle chatter, Miss Marple kept her thoughts to herself, allowing the villagers to discuss their theories without interference. The most prominent theory that had emerged was, of course, that Grafton's death had been the result of a violent altercation between him and Margaret Dell, the young schoolteacher. The idea of an affair was being whispered around the village, and Margaret's visible distress in the days following the death had done nothing to quell the rumors. She had become the obvious suspect, despite the lack of direct evidence connecting her to the crime. Margaret had been avoiding eye contact with nearly everyone since the day of Grafton's death, which only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. It was said that she had a motive. Her feelings for Grafton were believed to be far more intense than she had admitted. And while Miss Marple had always known the tendency for people to draw conclusions based on emotions rather than evidence, she could not help but acknowledge that there was something about Margaret's behavior that seemed off. As Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire later that morning, a soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She looked up, surprised by the visitor's arrival. It was Margaret Dell, her face drawn and pale, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice shaky, "I need to speak with you." Miss Marple nodded gently and motioned for Margaret to sit. Her tone was as calm and reassuring as ever. "Of course, my dear. You seem troubled." Margaret sank into the chair across from Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She seemed fragile, her shoulders hunched as if weighed down by something far greater than her outward demeanor let on. "I don't know where to turn, Miss Marple," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. Everyone is saying such awful things. They think I killed him." She paused, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple studied her quietly, allowing the silence to settle. Before speaking, "I know you didn't, my dear. But sometimes people's suspicions are rooted in things they don't fully understand. Tell me, what was your relationship with Mr. Grafton? Margaret swallowed hard. We were friends, Miss Marple. That's all. He was kind to me, and we had a few conversations here and there, but I never meant to get close to him. I didn't want to. She stopped herself, biting her lip. But then they changed. He started acting differently, and I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of insight crossing her mind. She had been watching Margaret carefully, and there was something in her words that hinted at an uncomfortable truth. Something had shifted in their dynamic, and it wasn't as simple as a harmless friendship. You mean he began showing more interest in you? Miss Marple probed gently. Margaret's eyes dropped to the floor, and she nodded. Yes, at first it wasn't anything, just small things, compliments, little gestures, nothing too serious. But then it felt like he was always around, and I didn't know how to make him stop. He was too much for me. He was too intense. Miss Marple watched her closely, reading her words and her body language with practiced ease. There was no doubt in Miss Marple's mind that Margaret had been overwhelmed, perhaps even frightened by Grafton's behavior. But did that make her capable of murder? Miss Marple didn't think so. There was a deeper thread to this mystery, one that was yet to reveal itself fully. She reached out, her hand resting gently on Margaret's. Tell me, Margaret, did you ever speak to anyone else about how you were feeling? Did anyone else notice the change in his behavior? Margaret hesitated, her brow furrowed as she thought back. No, not really, at least not anyone close. I told Mrs. Richardson once, just that things were a bit strange, but she dismissed it. She thought I was overreacting. This was significant. Mrs. Richardson had, after all, been the one to find Grafton's body. She had seen the two of them interact during the harvest tea and had even spoken to Margaret directly. Miss Marple's mind was racing now. She had already noted that Mrs. Richardson had been far more distressed than the situation warranted, especially considering how calm and composed she usually appeared in moments of crisis. Margaret's voice brought Miss Marple back to the present. You don't think I could have done it, do you, Miss Marple? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple patted her hand gently, offering a reassuring smile. No, my dear, I don't think you did. But you are caught in the web of suspicion, and that can be a very dangerous place to be. What we need now is the truth, and we must find it before anyone else gets hurt. A hidden clue. More than meets the eye. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village square, her thoughts swirling around Margaret's words. There was something unsettling about the way Grafton had conducted himself around her, and Miss Marple couldn't ignore the faint but persistent feeling that Grafton's behavior had been more than just the harmless flirtations of a lonely man. It was then that Miss Marple's gaze fell on the Bramley house, Charles Grafton's home, a sprawling, slightly dilapidated estate on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown hedges and neglected gardens. The house seemed to hold the secrets of its former inhabitants, and now it was Grafton's turn to leave his mark. Without a clear plan in mind, Miss Marple walked toward the house. She had visited it only once since Grafton's arrival in the village, but she had seen enough to know that it was a place of quiet elegance. However, something about the way the front door hung slightly ajar caught her attention. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the kind of smell that came with abandonment. As she walked through the dimly lit hallway, Miss Marple's eyes caught a glint of something on the floor near the fireplace. It was a cufflink. A gold cufflink engraved with the initials CG. Miss Marple bent down to pick it up, her heart racing. She had found something important. Something that connected Grafton to the room where he had died. But why was it here? Was this the clue that would finally reveal the truth? She didn't know yet, but she was certain it was a piece of the puzzle. The game was moving forward, and Miss Marple could feel the pressure building. There was still much to uncover, and she was determined to do so, no matter where the investigation would lead her. The discovery of the cufflink had shaken Miss Marple, but it was only a small step toward uncovering the larger truth. As the why. Days passed. The village continued to hum with activity, its usual pace disturbed by the shadow of Charles Grafton's death. Yet beneath the surface, the community had begun to fracture. The suspicion swirling around Margaret Dell intensified, and the whispers that had begun as quiet rumors now took on a more insistent tone. But it was the appearance of Mrs. Richardson, the village chairwoman, that Miss Marple was most concerned with. She had always been a woman of strong convictions, self-assured and composed in the face of any crisis, yet her behavior since Grafton's death had been anything but composed. Miss Marple had watched her closely, noting the nervous tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, the way her gaze darted to the side when the conversation turned to the incident. Mrs. Richardson's discomfort was palpable. Miss Marple had observed enough to know that the woman was hiding something, but what? Was it a matter of guilt, or was there more at play? The key, Miss Marple suspected, lay in the relationship between Mrs. Richardson and Grafton. The woman had always been the epitome of propriety, a bastion of the village's old-world charm. But beneath that surface, Miss Marple had seen signs of a deeper connection between her and Grafton. The question was, what had been the nature of that connection? The conversation with Mrs. Richardson. Miss Marple's opportunity to speak with Mrs. Richardson came that afternoon, when the two women found themselves alone in the village hall, preparing for the next social gathering. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the curtains as the wind outside whispered through the windows. Mrs. Richardson was at the far end of the hall, adjusting a tablecloth with more force than necessary, her movements stiff, almost jerky. Miss Marple stood quietly at the doorway, observing her. "Mrs. Richardson," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear enough to catch the other woman's attention. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." The chairwoman's shoulders stiffened, but she turned slowly, offering Miss Marple a forced smile. "Of course, Miss Marple. What is it you need?" "I'm afraid I must ask you some difficult questions," Miss Marple continued, her tone measured but firm. "It's about Mr. Grafton." At the mention of his name, Mrs. Richardson's smile faltered. She set the tablecloth down with a soft thud and straightened her back, clearly uncomfortable. "I told Constable Foster everything I know. There's nothing more to say." "Ah, but I believe there is," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "You were the one who found him, weren't you? And you've been quite distressed ever since. Surely there's something more you can tell me. Perhaps something you've been too afraid to mention?" Mrs. Richardson's eyes widened, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the slightest flicker of fear cross her face before it was quickly masked. The chairwoman opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to think better of it, closing it again with a snap. Miss Marple waited patiently, giving her time to gather her thoughts. I've already told you everything, Miss Marple," Mrs. Richardson finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "I found him in the chair just as I said. It was horrible, just horrible. And then I did what anyone would do. I called for help." "Yes, but I've been thinking about something," Miss Marple pressed. "I've heard that you and Mr. Grafton had, how shall I put it, a history. A history that might have influenced your reaction when you found him." Mrs. Richardson's face paled at this, and for the first time since Miss Marple had known her, she looked genuinely frightened. The woman took a deep breath, her gaze falling to the floor as if searching for an escape. "You're mistaken," Mrs. Richardson said softly. "There was no history, not the way you're implying. Mr. Grafton was just a man, a new face in the village, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady, watching her closely. "I see. And yet, it was you who found him. It was you who seemed so deeply affected, so disturbed by the event. I wonder if there's something in your past, something about Mr. Grafton, that you've been unwilling to share." Mrs. Richardson's lips quivered, and Miss Marple could see her wrestling with her emotions. There was more here than the woman was willing to admit, and Miss Marple knew it. She needed to tread carefully. "Sometimes, Mrs. Richardson," Miss Marple said gently, The past has a way of catching up with us, and sometimes it's the things we least want to confront that can help us understand the present. I would be grateful if you could share with me what really happened." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought Mrs. Richardson might remain silent. But then the older woman spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew him," Mrs. Richardson said, her words coming slowly as though each one weighed heavily on her. "I knew Charles Grafton long before he came to this village." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "How long before?" Mrs. Richardson's eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something darker, something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "Years ago. We were involved. Briefly. When I was younger, before I met my late husband. But it was a long time ago, and I thought I had forgotten." Miss Marple's mind was racing. There it was, the missing piece of the puzzle. And when he came to St. Mary's Hollow. Was it by chance? Mrs. Richardson didn't answer immediately. She turned away from Miss Marple, looking out the window as though trying to avoid the gravity of the question. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a murmur. "No, it wasn't by chance. He came here because of me. He came to find me." The hidden motive. Uncovering the truth. Miss Marple's mind was alight with the implications of what Mrs. Richardson had just revealed. The old village chairwoman had a past she had been desperately trying to bury. The revelation that Grafton had come to the village to seek her out was the key that Miss Marple had been searching for. But why? Why had Grafton sought her out after all these years? "I never wanted him here," Mrs. Richardson continued, her voice shaking now with a mixture of fear and regret. "When I saw him at the tea, I knew. I knew this was what he was after all along. He was going to bring everything back up, everything I thought I had buried." Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone gentle but insistent. "Mrs. Richardson, I think you've carried this burden long enough. It's time to tell the truth. What was it that Mr. Grafton wanted from you?" Mrs. Richardson closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He wanted me back, Miss Marple. He wanted us to pick up where we had left off. But I couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. My husband would never have understood." "Did he threaten you, Mrs. Richardson?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but sharp with the weight of the question. For a long time, Mrs. Richardson said nothing, but finally she nodded, her face twisted in anguish. "He didn't have to threaten me, but he knew things. He knew things that could ruin me, and when I refused him, when I told him I couldn't be involved with him again, he became angry. I didn't know what he might do." Miss Marple stood still, absorbing the gravity of what she had just learned. Mrs. Richardson had been hiding a secret, one that connected her to Grafton in a way that no one had suspected. But how did this tie into his death? And more importantly, did it give anyone in the village a reason to kill him? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Miss Marple knew there was still much more to uncover. She wasn't finished yet. There were still more secrets lurking beneath the surface, and she would uncover them all, no matter the cost. The weight of Mrs. Richardson's revelation hung heavily in the air as Miss Marple left the village hall. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to take shape, but they weren't yet in their final place. The revelation that Charles Grafton had come to the village seeking reconciliation with Mrs. Richardson, after years of silence, seemed to be the key to unlocking his motives. The question was, why had he come back now, after all these years? And why had Mrs. Richardson been so desperate to bury their past? Miss Marple knew she was close, closer than ever, but there was still something amiss, something that tugged at the edges of her mind. She had barely made it to the edge of the village square when a sudden commotion caught her attention. A small group of villagers had gathered near the entrance to the local butcher's shop, their voices raised in shock and alarm. As Miss Marple approached, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Not again. It can't be happening again. Is he really dead?" Miss Marple quickened her pace, her heart beating faster as she reached the crowd. She pushed her way through, her eyes locking onto the scene before her, a body, unmistakably lifeless, lying in the doorway of the butcher's shop. the same spot where, only a few days ago, Grafton had been seen alive. But this time, the scene was different. This time, it wasn't Grafton. The body belonged to none other than Margaret Dell, the village schoolteacher. Miss Marple's heart sank as she took in the sight. Margaret lay still, her face pale, her eyes wide open in terror. She was dressed in the same simple, modest dress she had worn to the harvest tea just days ago. Her hands were clenched tightly at her sides as though she had been trying to ward off something or someone. "Margaret!" cried Mrs. Watkins, the baker's wife, her voice trembling with shock. "What on earth has happened to her?" Miss Marple pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Margaret's body. She could feel the coldness in the air, the chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The young woman's body was still warm, but only just, too warm to have been lying there for long. The constable, Mr. Foster, was already there, fumbling nervously as he tried to assess the situation. "Not again," he muttered, shaking his head. "Not another one." Miss Marple glanced up at him, her mind racing. What happened? Was there any sign of struggle? The constable hesitated before answering, his eyes flicking nervously around the crowd. "We don't know yet. There was no sign of any physical injury. It's as if she just collapsed. But there's something odd, something off about it." Miss Marple's gaze flickered over to the butcher's shop. It was quiet now, the doors closed, the windows shuttered. But the shopkeeper, a man named Mr. Hargrove, was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple stood, her eyes scanning the crowd. Did anyone see Margaret here recently? Before this happened? A few villagers exchanged confused glances, but no one seemed to have an answer. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the details in her head. Grafton's death had been unsettling, yes, but now, with Margaret's sudden and unexplained demise, everything had taken on an even darker tone. What was happening in this village? The sequence of events. A pattern emerges. As the constable directed the crowd to disperse, Miss Marple remained behind, quietly observing the scene. She couldn't shake the feeling that these two deaths were connected. There was a pattern, a thread that tied them together. The timing, the circumstances, even the location seemed to suggest as much. She made her way back to the village hall, where the shadows were growing longer as the day drew to a close. There she found Mrs. Richardson still lingering, as if waiting for something or someone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression drawn. "Miss Marple, I don't understand," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice trembling. "Why is all of this happening? First Charles, and now poor Margaret. What does it mean?" Miss Marple paused, considering the chairwoman's words. "It's a mystery, Mrs. Richardson," she said softly. "But there's something here. Something that ties these deaths together. And I believe we're getting closer to the truth." Mrs. Richardson's face paled further. "I don't understand. What do you mean? What could be the connection?" "The connection," Miss Marple said, "is in the past. It's in the things people try to bury and forget, but that never truly go away. It's in the secrets that people keep and the truths they refuse to face." Mrs. Richardson's eyes widened in understanding, but before she could speak, Miss Marple turned and walked toward the door. "I must go," she said over her shoulder. "There's someone I need to speak with." The hidden connection. A final conversation. Miss Marple had always believed that the key to any mystery lay in understanding the motivations of those involved. She had spent her life observing people, noting their actions, their words, their unspoken gestures. And now, as the sun set on the quiet village of St. Mary's Hollow, she knew that the time had come to bring everything into focus. She walked briskly toward the Bramley house, the place where it all began. She had already uncovered so much: Mrs. Richardson's past with Grafton, the strange circumstances of his death, and now, the untimely passing of Margaret. But there was one person who could provide the final piece of the puzzle. One person who had remained until now strangely silent. Miss Marple had never quite trusted Mr. Hargrove, the butcher. There was something about the way he had behaved. When Grafton had died, something in his eyes that Miss Marple had noted but not fully understood at the time. He had been the last person to see both of the victims alive, and there was something about his proximity to both deaths that unsettled her. The door to the butcher's shop creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, the smell of fresh meat mingling with the cold air of the evening. Inside, Mr. Hargrove was standing behind the counter, sharpening his knives, as though the events of the past few days had not disturbed him in the least. He didn't even look up as Miss Marple entered. "Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but firm. He glanced up, startled. "Miss Marple, what can I do for you?" "I need to ask you some questions," she said, her gaze locking onto his. "About Margaret Dell, and about Charles Grafton." Mr. Hargrove stiffened. His eyes flickered nervously toward the back of the shop before he straightened up, his jaw tightening. "I have nothing to say about that," he muttered, his voice low. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "I think you do, Mr. Hargrove, and I think you know exactly what's been going on in this village. It's time you told me the truth." Miss Marple was certain now. The answers she sought were within this man's reach, and with the truth just beyond her grasp, she knew the final revelation was close at hand. The pieces were falling into place. It was only a matter of time before everything would be revealed. The air inside the butcher's shop was thick with the smell of meat and cold stone. It was a peculiar contrast to the tension that simmered between Miss Marple and Mr. Hargrove, who stood behind the counter, his knife still glinting under the dim light. Despite his calm exterior, his body was taut with nervous energy, betraying the wariness in his eyes. Miss Marple, as always, remained composed, a quiet observer of the subtle shifts in his demeanor. "I know you've been avoiding questions, Mr. Hargrove," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving his. "But I'm afraid it's time we address some things. There's been far too much death in this village, and your involvement is more significant than you think." Hargrove's hand paused mid-motion, the knife momentarily hovering above the block of meat. His eyes flickered toward the door as if contemplating an escape, but he quickly regained his composure and continued working, albeit with a slight tremor in his movements. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice controlled but laced with an underlying hint of panic. "I'm just a simple butcher, nothing more to it." "Are you?" Miss Marple said, stepping closer, her voice low yet probing. "Because you see, Mr. Hargrove, everything about you seems too simple, too clean. The last person to see both Grafton and Margaret alive. And yet, you remain strangely untouched by the suspicions that have plagued the village. Why is that?" There was a long silence before he spoke again. His hands paused in midair as if carefully considering his response. "I'm not involved in any of this, Miss Marple. I don't have anything to do with their deaths." He exhaled sharply, clearly uncomfortable with the pressure mounting in the room. "You're lying, Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering. "I can see it in the way your eyes shift, in the way your fingers twitch at the handle of that knife. I've spent a lifetime studying human nature, and you, my dear man, are hiding something, perhaps even more than you realize." His gaze darted to the butcher's knives behind him, a flicker of fear flashing in his eyes before he quickly looked away. Miss Marple's sharp intuition was closing in on the truth, but she knew the most effective way to extract the final confession would be to play her cards carefully. It was time for the final test. "You see, Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple continued, her voice softening, "there's no reason for you to be afraid. If you just tell me the truth, I can promise you that everything will make sense. The village will understand, and we can all move on." Hargrove stiffened, his hand tightening around the knife's handle. His lips trembled as he finally spoke, his voice low and strained. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. It was never supposed to go this far." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her heart quickening. Finally, the crack in his armor had appeared. "What happened, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked softly, her voice almost maternal now. "Tell me everything, the truth. The confession, unraveling the deception." The room seemed to still as Hargrove lowered his gaze, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on the counter. He seemed to struggle with the weight of the truth, and Miss Marple, ever patient, let the silence drag on, knowing that he needed to make the first move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hargrove spoke in a hushed, broken voice. "I didn't mean for Grafton to die. I swear. He was blackmailing me." Miss Marple's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place with a rapidity she hadn't anticipated. Hargrove, it seemed, had a far deeper involvement in these deaths than she had imagined. She remained silent, allowing him to continue. "He had evidence," Hargrove muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Evidence from years ago, from when I was younger. He threatened to expose me. Everything about my past. I didn't have a choice." Miss Marple's mind flashed back to Mrs. Richardson's confession earlier. The past had come back to haunt them all, and it seemed that Hargrove's sins were just as buried and just as dangerous as Mrs. Richardson's. It wasn't just the surface gossip that had created the tension in the village. It was the long-hidden secrets, the buried transgressions that had festered beneath the lives of so many. "You killed him, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked softly, the words barely escaping her lips. Hargrove's face twisted in anguish, his eyes suddenly filled with shame and terror. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to leave. I confronted him in the shop the night he died. I told him I wouldn't be blackmailed anymore, that I would go to the police and tell them everything if he didn't stop. But he wouldn't listen. He kept pushing and I lost control. I struck him. I didn't mean to, but I hit him with the butcher's cleaver just once, and he fell." Miss Marple took a deep breath, feeling a profound sadness wash over her. This was not the man she had expected to find behind the mask of composure. He was a victim of his own choices, his own secrets, and now he was unraveling. She studied him for a moment, her gaze calm and unwavering. "I understand, Mr. Hargrove," she said quietly, her voice filled with a strange compassion. "But you didn't stop there, did you? You knew the village would suspect someone. You knew the police would be quick to jump to conclusions. So you planted the idea that Margaret was involved. You used her to cover your tracks." His eyes widened in horror, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of true fear in his gaze. No, it wasn't like that," he stammered, shaking his head. "I didn't mean for her to get hurt. I didn't kill her, I swear. I thought she could help me, make it look like it was her. She was the one who found him, but she wasn't supposed to get involved. She just got too close. I didn't expect her to start asking questions." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And that's why you had to kill her, isn't it? She knew too much. She became a liability." Hargrove collapsed against the counter, his hands gripping, the edge as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "I didn't want to, Miss Marple. I never wanted to kill anyone. But once I'd done it, I couldn't stop. And when she started getting closer, asking questions, I couldn't risk it. I couldn't let her expose me." The truth emerges. The final pieces. The truth had finally spilled from Mr. Hargrove's lips, but the revelation left Miss Marple with more questions than answers. The butcher had not only been involved in Grafton's death, but had also been responsible for Margaret's untimely end. The web of deceit was far more intricate than she had initially imagined, and now, the full scope of the tragedy was beginning to unfold. "But why?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low but firm. "Why did Grafton target you in the first place? What was it that he had on you?" Hargrove looked up, his face contorted with guilt. "It wasn't just me. There were others who were involved, people from long ago. Grafton came here because he knew about the things we'd done. He wasn't the only one who had secrets to hide. I was trying to bury it all, but I couldn't run away from it forever." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the tangled threads of the mystery. She had known that there was more to Grafton's arrival than met the eye, and now she understood. His death and Margaret's were not the result of chance, but the culmination of years of buried guilt, hidden lives, and long-forgotten sins. You will face the consequences for your actions, Mr. Hargrove, Miss Marple said gently but resolutely. But the truth will come to light, and that is the only thing that can bring any of us peace. As Hargrove collapsed into the chair, behind him, his head hanging low in defeat, Miss Marple stood and walked out of the shop, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. The village of St. Mary's Hollow would never be the same, but at least now the truth was finally free, and with it, the promise of justice. The sun had set, casting a long shadow across the village of St. Mary's Hollow. The stillness of the evening was broken only by the sound of distant murmurs, whispers of the shocking truths that were slowly beginning to surface. The village, once peaceful and undisturbed, was now full of uncertainty and tension. And yet, for Miss Marple, the silence held the promise of resolution. It was a strange comfort to her, knowing that the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. All that remained was to connect them, seamlessly, carefully, and expose the truth once and for all. Miss Marple stood outside the butcher's shop, her mind racing through the details. She had confronted Mr. Hargrove, and the pieces of the story had fallen into place. Charles Grafton's death had been no accident. Neither had Margaret Dell's. Both had been caught in the web of Mr. Hargrove's desperate efforts to hide the sins of the past. But it wasn't just Hargrove's actions that had sealed their fates. It was his determination to silence anyone who posed a threat to his carefully constructed life. A life built on secrets and lies. But Miss Marple knew there was still something that remained unresolved. There was one final thread that needed to be pulled, one final question that needed to be asked. It wasn't enough to know who had killed Grafton and Margaret. Miss Marple needed to understand why, and why the village had been chosen as the battleground for this hidden war. Her thoughts turned once again to Mrs. Richardson. It was clear that Grafton's past connection to the chairwoman was more than just a footnote in the story. There was something more to her reaction upon learning of Grafton's arrival in St. Mary's Hollow, a fear that had lingered, even after Grafton's death. Miss Marple was certain that Mrs. Richardson knew more than she had admitted. It was time to confront her once again, to seek the final piece of the puzzle. A final confrontation. Mrs. Richardson's last secret. The village hall was quiet as Miss Marple made her way inside. It was late, and the faint smell of evening tea still lingered in the air. Mrs. Richardson sat alone by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She looked older than Miss Marple remembered, more fragile, perhaps, or simply more burdened by the weight of the secrets she carried. "Mrs. Richardson," Miss Marple said softly, her voice calm but insistent. "We need to talk." The chairwoman looked up, her expression guarded, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of resignation in her eyes. She knew this conversation had to happen. It was the only way forward. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Richardson said quietly, her voice carrying a mix of sadness and reluctant acceptance. "I know what you're going to ask me." Miss Marple seated herself across from the chairwoman, her gaze steady. "Do you?" Mrs. Richardson nodded, her lips tightening into a thin line. "You figured it all out, haven't you? You know about Charles, and what he came here for." "I know more than you think, Mrs. Richardson," Miss Marple replied softly. "But there is still one thing that remains unclear to me, and that's why you let it happen. Why you allowed it all to go this far." Mrs. Richardson's face paled as the weight of Miss Marple's words sank in. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "Charles was relentless. When he came to the village, I thought I could ignore him, that I could keep my past buried. But when he started seeing Margaret, when he started turning his attention to her, I knew he wasn't going to stop. I was afraid, Miss Marple. Afraid of what he might do if I didn't comply." "You were afraid of what, exactly?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. "What was it that Grafton had on you that made you so terrified?" Mrs. Richardson's eyes welled with tears, and she swallowed hard. "He knew about my indiscretions. The things I did when I was younger. The things I thought I had buried, erased from my life. Charles threatened to expose me, everything about my past, everything I had worked so hard to hide, and I couldn't bear the thought of it all coming out. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle, but insistent. But you didn't do anything, did you? You didn't confront him, you didn't stop him. Instead, you allowed him to manipulate everyone, even after he was dead. Mrs. Richardson closed her eyes, her hands trembling in her lap. I didn't know what to do. He was already gone. When he died, I thought maybe it would be over. But when Margaret started asking questions, when she started digging into things she shouldn't have, I panicked. I didn't want anyone else to know the truth. I didn't want anyone to know what had really happened. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she pieced the final part of the puzzle together. So you were complicit, even if you didn't pull the trigger, so to speak. You allowed Mr. Hargrove to continue his efforts to cover up the truth, and you helped push Margaret into a corner, didn't you? Mrs. Richardson's lips trembled, and she looked away, her shame evident in the way she averted Miss Marple's gaze. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, but I didn't want my past to destroy everything I had worked for. I couldn't bear the thought of being exposed. Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. You were trying to protect yourself, Mrs. Richardson, but in doing so, you allowed a tragedy to unfold. And now, we are left to deal with the consequences. The final piece of the puzzle. Unmasking the real motive. Miss Marple stood up, her mind whirling as she processed the final pieces of the confession. It was clear now that the murder of Charles Grafton had been a direct result of his blackmail, and that the village's quiet facade had been shattered by secrets far darker than anyone had imagined. But there was still one lingering question that Miss Marple needed to answer. Why had Mr. Hargrove been so determined to silence both Grafton and Margaret? What was it that had made him resort to such violence? Miss Marple knew that the answers were not just hidden in the butcher's shop or in Mrs. Richardson's confession. The truth was woven into the fabric of the village itself, into the relationships and the history that everyone had tried so desperately to keep hidden. Grafton had arrived to uncover those secrets, but it was the fear of exposure, the shame of buried pasts that had sealed his fate, and Margaret's as well. As Miss Marple turned to leave the hall, she glanced back at Mrs. Richardson. You need to face the consequences of your actions, just as Mr. Hargrove will. It's the only way for this village to heal. Mrs. Richardson nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I never meant for any of this. I just wanted to forget. You can't forget, Mrs. Richardson, Miss Marple replied softly. But you can make things right. The village of St. Mary's Hollow would never be the same. The truth had come to light, and with it the heavy burden of guilt and shame that had shadowed the lives of its residents for so long. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple walked away, her mind at peace, knowing that justice would finally be served. The crisp evening air of St. Mary's Hollow had settled into a quiet peace, though a profound unease lingered beneath the surface. The village, which had once been a picture of serenity, now bore the weight of a secret long hidden. As the final confessions were spoken and the truths revealed, Miss Marple knew that the village would never be quite the same again. It was an odd feeling, watching the calm return, despite the unraveling of so many lives. The world outside might have continued as before, the days passing without pause, but the lives of the villagers had been irrevocably changed. Yet, as Miss Marple reflected on it all, she also realized that the return to normalcy, however fragile, was a necessary step. People had to move on, after all. It was the nature of life. But even in the wake of such revelations, some part of the village still seemed to cling to the past. People had begun to look over their shoulders, as though still haunted by the shadows of old secrets. And yet Miss Marple could sense that the fog of suspicion would lift in time. The truth had emerged, and the people of St. Mary's Hollow could finally begin to heal, albeit with difficulty. As she made her way through the village square, the rhythmic sound of her footsteps echoed against the cobblestones. The small shops were closing, their warm lights flickering off the cobblestones as the village readied itself for the night. The small houses, tucked behind thick hedgerows and ivy-clad gates, seemed serene once more, no longer shrouded in the tense energy that had marked the last few weeks. But Miss Marple knew better than to let the outward calm deceive her. It wasn't that the village was truly at peace. No, peace was something more fleeting and fragile than that. The quiet of St. Mary's Hollow was merely the calm after a storm, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the rhythms of human nature, could feel that something more profound was shifting. The unexpected visitor. An offer of help. Just as Miss Marple passed the gate of her modest cottage, she was stopped by a familiar figure. Mrs. Richardson stood before her, her face more composed than it had been in their earlier conversation. Her features, though still touched by sorrow, were calmer now, her expression less burdened by guilt. There was a certain resolve in the way she held herself. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Richardson said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "I've been thinking, and I need to thank you for everything. For finding the truth, for helping me face what I couldn't, and for not giving up on the village." Miss Marple smiled gently, nodding in acknowledgement. "You've done the hardest part, Mrs. Richardson. It wasn't easy, but you faced it. And that's more than most could do." The older woman hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I've decided to leave, Miss Marple. It's time. I can't stay here anymore. Not after everything that's happened. My past. It's something I need to leave behind. Perhaps in another place I can start fresh. I want to atone for my mistakes." Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. Leaving may seem like an escape, but the truth is you can only move forward by facing the consequences of your actions. You must learn to forgive yourself. The village won't forget, but they will understand in time. That's all we can ask. Mrs. Richardson's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded, a sense of quiet acceptance washing over her. "I know you're right. I've always admired your strength, Miss Marple. Perhaps I'll learn to have that kind of peace in my own life." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Peace is never something you find in a place, Mrs. Richardson. It's something you carry within yourself. If you're ready, you'll find it wherever you go." The police investigation, the closing of the case. The following morning, the village was abuzz with talk of the final resolution. The police investigation had concluded swiftly, the evidence overwhelming. Mr. Hargrove had confessed to both murders, first to Grafton's death, which had been the result of an impulsive, violent outburst, and then to Margaret's, whom he had killed in a panic, fearing that she would expose him. The confession had been corroborated by witnesses, and the evidence was irrefutable. The constable, though somewhat reluctant to admit it, had been grateful for Miss Marple's quiet assistance in solving the case. He had done his best to follow the trail of evidence, but Miss Marple's insights had been invaluable. The discovery of the cufflink, the body positions, the whispered secrets, it had all come together, and now the case was closed. Yet, despite the resolution, Miss Marple knew that this was not the end of the story. The village would still carry the scars of what had transpired, and though the justice had been served, the true healing would take much longer. As she walked toward the constable's office, she noticed the somber expressions on the faces of the villagers who passed her by. Their glances were wary but respectful, as if they had seen something that could never be unseen. She caught the eyes of a few familiar faces, each one offering a nod of recognition. It was a strange mixture of respect and lingering unease. Entering the constable's office, Miss Marple found him seated at his desk, poring over paperwork. He looked up as she entered and gave her a tired but grateful smile. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, setting down the papers in front of him. "It seems that this case is officially closed. I couldn't have done it without you, of course. Your sharp eye for detail made all the difference." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "It was a team effort, Constable. But sometimes it's the smallest details, the things people overlook, that hold the key to everything." The constable nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose that's true. There's something you've taught me about paying attention to the things we don't always notice. Even in a village like ours, where everyone thinks they know everyone's business, there's always something hidden beneath the surface." Miss Marple's expression softened as she glanced out the window, watching the village in the distance. Yes, Constable, that's always the case. People hide their fears, their regrets, their pain, sometimes so deeply that they forget they're even hiding it themselves. It takes a sharp mind and a patient heart to understand the truth that lies beneath all of that. The constable leaned back in his chair, staring at her with a newfound appreciation. I think I'll remember that, Miss Marple, and I'll make sure to pass on the lesson. I suppose this case is finally over then. No more mysteries in St. Mary's Hollow? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling slightly. Perhaps not for now, but in my experience, Constable, there's always another story waiting to be told. Another mystery hiding in plain sight. As she left the office, the weight of the case began to settle in her bones. The village had returned to normal, at least on the surface. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe that everything was truly as it seemed. There was always more to the story, always more waiting just beneath the surface. And as she walked back toward her home, she couldn't help but smile to herself. She would be ready when the next mystery came knocking on her door. After all, she knew better than anyone that there was no such thing as a truly quiet village. There would always be another secret, another story, just waiting to be uncovered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over St. Mary's Hollow, Miss Marple walked into the peaceful evening, the mystery of the past behind her and a new one always just around the corner. The peaceful routine of St. Mary's Hollow had slowly returned, though the scars of the recent events still lingered beneath the surface. As the village resumed its normal pace, life seemed to regain its gentle rhythm. Gardens tended to, children's, laughter echoing down the lanes, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery each morning. The storm of secrets had passed, but the aftershocks still rippled through the small community, leaving its people forever changed. Miss Marple, though, was accustomed to the ebb and flow of human nature. She understood the complexities that resided in the quiet corners of everyday life. The village had returned to its customary quietness, and yet she knew that such periods were fleeting. It was merely the calm before the next storm, a storm she could not predict, but one she was always ready for. The days passed, and Miss Marple spent much of her time in her small, cozy cottage. The scent of lavender filled the air, mingling with the scent of freshly brewed tea as she sat by the fire, knitting quietly. The small town might have felt peaceful, but Miss Marple's sharp mind never fully rested. It was in the quiet moments that she often observed the most. Small gestures, fleeting expressions, quiet conversations that might seem innocuous to others, but told a different story to someone who paid close attention. It wasn't long before Miss Marple found herself back in the village hall, attending a small gathering of the local women. It was a social occasion, a simple afternoon tea, yet it allowed her to slip back into the fold of village life. She observed the women with her usual quiet demeanor, noticing how they spoke in hushed tones, glancing around nervously at one another. The topic of Charles Grafton and Margaret Dell had faded, but the way they spoke now about other matters hinted at a quiet unease that remained. Miss Marple knew that it wasn't just the events surrounding the deaths that lingered. It was the collective sense of guilt that had settled in the village's heart. People were still wrestling with the aftermath of their silence, their complicity. They had, at some level, turned a blind eye to the secrets and the truth that had festered beneath their quaint, picturesque lives. Now, with the truth out in the open, they had to come to terms with it. And yet, Miss Marple saw something in their eyes as they spoke of the day's events, a deep sense of relief, of being unburdened. The air, heavy with the weight of unspoken words, was slowly lifting. It would take time, but the village was healing. An unexpected visit. A conversation with Constable Foster. The late afternoon light was fading as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her basket of knitting supplies tucked under her arm. The day had been quiet, but there was something in the air that told her she wasn't quite finished with the events that had shaken the village. Her instincts told her that there was still more to uncover, and she had learned long ago not to dismiss that feeling. As she rounded the corner of her home, she was met with the unexpected sight of Constable Foster standing at her door. The constable, typically a man of few words and more accustomed to his paperwork, had a look of unease about him that piqued her curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Constable." she replied, her tone warm and welcoming. "What brings you to my doorstep?" The constable hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. He seemed unusually tense. "I've been thinking about the case, the Grafton and Dell deaths. We've closed the investigation, but something doesn't sit right with me." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "You've come to see me because something is still troubling you?" "Yes," Foster admitted, glancing around as if ensuring no one was listening. "You were right about everything. You uncovered the truth, and I can't deny that. But there's one thing I can't shake off. A detail that I didn't think was important at the time. But now it feels like it was." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit. "Please, Constable, tell me what's troubling you." He took a seat across from her, clearly uncomfortable. "It's about Mrs. Richardson. I've been thinking about what," she said, the way she reacted after Grafton's death. It was too much for someone who just lost a man from her past. She seemed more disturbed than was reasonable for someone simply remembering old painful memories. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had already noticed Mrs. Richardson's overreaction to Grafton's death, but she had assumed it was connected to the guilt of her past coming back to haunt her. Yet Foster's words made her consider the possibility that there was more to the story than even she had realized. "You believe Mrs. Richardson might know more than she has let on?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. Foster nodded slowly. "There's something in her behavior, something I missed at the time. Her desperation to distance herself from the entire affair. It felt too forced. I wonder if she wasn't just trying to protect herself. Maybe she was protecting someone else." Miss Marple's thoughts began to race. Mrs. Richardson had been more involved than anyone had realized, not just as a victim of Grafton's blackmail, but as someone who might have been a key player in the events that had led to his death. Could there have been more to her role in all this than simply being manipulated? Could she have been complicit in a way that went beyond mere fear of exposure? Foster's eyes met Miss Marple's, and she could see the uncertainty in his gaze. "You think she was involved in more than just hiding her past?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't know yet, Constable," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "but your instincts are right. There's more here, something we overlooked. Something that connects all the pieces together, beyond what we already know." Foster's face tightened as he leaned forward, his brow furrowed in frustration. "But what could it be, Miss Marple? What could she be hiding now? We've already uncovered everything." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind whirling. She hadn't been wrong in thinking the case was resolved, but Foster's intuition had given her pause. Mrs. Richardson's behavior was troubling, yes, but there was still one more layer to peel back. Something that didn't make sense. It wasn't just about the past or the blackmail anymore. The threads of guilt, fear, and deception were tangled too tightly for it to be simple. "We need to go back to the beginning, Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "We need to look at everything again, with fresh eyes." Foster blinked at her, surprised by the sudden shift in Miss Marple's demeanor. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand, signaling him to wait. "Let's start with Mrs. Richardson's interactions with Grafton. Before his arrival here, before the blackmail and before the murders," Miss Marple continued, her voice now sharp with purpose. "If we can find the missing link in that relationship, we may uncover the final secret that ties it all together." The unspoken truth. Returning to the core of the mystery. As the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the village, Miss Marple felt the shift in the air once again. Something was still hidden, something that had slipped through the cracks of the investigation. She had always trusted her instincts, and now, more than ever, she knew she had to follow the trail wherever it led. The case wasn't finished. Not yet. The true mystery lay in the space between the words spoken and those left unsaid. It was in the secrets people had tried so hard to bury, in the quiet corners where guilt festered. And Miss Marple was determined to uncover the last hidden layer, the final piece of the puzzle. Tomorrow would bring another conversation, another discovery, and she would be ready. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early. The chill in the air hinted at the arrival of autumn, yet there was a warmth in the light of the early sun as it filtered through the trees. A calmness had descended upon the village, a feeling of normalcy that had returned, even though Miss Marple knew it was merely a thin veneer, an outer peace hiding the ripples of disturbance still lingering in the hearts of the people. She had spent the night reflecting on the words Constable Foster had shared. His instincts had hit something deep within her, and she had been unable to shake the feeling that there was more to Mrs. Richardson's involvement than had been revealed. Miss Marple had already uncovered so much, but there was always more, beneath the surface. And now, she knew, she had to revisit the woman at the heart of the village's secrets, Mrs. Richardson. Miss Marple walked with purpose through the village square, her eyes scanning the familiar streets. The air was crisp, and the sound of birds chirping filled the space around her. As she neared the village hall, she saw Mrs. Richardson standing near the front entrance, her posture rigid but composed. She was watching the villagers as they passed, by her expression distant, almost haunted. The chairwoman seemed more withdrawn than usual, as though the truth had sunk its roots deep into her heart. Miss Marple's instincts had never steered her wrong, and she knew that this conversation would provide the final piece of the puzzle. "Mrs. Richardson," Miss Marple called gently, her voice calm and welcoming. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." The chairwoman turned toward her, her face softening as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone polite but weary. "What brings you here today?" "I was hoping to speak with you again," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. "I think we need to revisit something that we may have overlooked." Mrs. Richardson's expression faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm not sure I understand, Miss Marple," she replied cautiously. "I believe you do, Mrs. Richardson," Miss Marple said softly. "You see, I've been thinking about your role in all of this. You've told me about your past with Mr. Grafton, and I'm sure that was difficult for you to face. But there's something more that I'm not convinced you've shared. The deeper connection between you and Charles Grafton, something that led to his arrival here." Mrs. Richardson shifted uncomfortably. "I told you everything I know, Miss Marple. You've uncovered the truth about Grafton's death, and She hesitated, her eyes darting away. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "You've told me part of the story, Mrs. Richardson, but I believe there's more. Something you're still holding back. I need you to think carefully. This village has been through too much for any more secrets to remain." The chairwoman's lips trembled as she stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was something almost fragile about her now, as if the weight of the past had finally broken through the walls she had so carefully built. "You're right," Mrs. Richardson said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "There is more. There's something I didn't want to tell anyone, something I feared would destroy everything." Miss Marple waited, her expression softening as she saw the vulnerability in Mrs. Richardson's eyes. "You can tell me, Mrs. Richardson. You don't have to carry this burden any longer." The chairwoman took a deep breath, steadying herself, before speaking. "When Grafton came to the village, it wasn't just for me. It wasn't just because he wanted to rekindle old flames. He had a much darker motive. He wasn't just looking for me. He was looking for leverage. I didn't know it at the time, but when he arrived, I started to realize that he had a plan." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "What kind of plan?" "I never thought I'd be the one to tell you this," Mrs. Richardson continued, her voice breaking as the floodgates opened. "But the truth is, Charles Grafton wasn't alone. He came here with someone else, someone who had their own agenda. A man from my past, a man who had worked with Grafton before." Miss Marple's mind raced. Who was this man? And how was he involved? "I don't know his real name," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice quivering. "But I do know he's dangerous. He was the one who helped Grafton with the blackmail, the one who told him to come here. Grafton wasn't just trying to ruin my life. He was trying to ruin all of us who were connected to the past." Miss Marple's thoughts were in turmoil. The revelation sent shockwaves through her understanding of the case. It wasn't just Grafton's personal vendetta against Mrs. Richardson that had caused the chain of events. It was something far bigger, something Miss Marple hadn't seen coming. This was no longer just about one man's revenge. It was about a network of old ties, a web of connections that stretched far beyond the village. "You must be careful, Miss Marple," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice filled with a sense of urgency. "Grafton and his accomplice, whoever he is, are dangerous. They've left a trail of destruction, and they won't stop until they've destroyed everything they can. I thought I could keep my secrets buried, but now it's too late." Miss Marple stood still, processing the gravity of what she was hearing. "This man, Mrs. Richardson, he's still in the village, isn't he?" Mrs. Richardson's gaze flickered to the door, as if she expected the man to appear at any moment. She nodded grimly. "Yes, he's been watching, waiting, and if we're not careful, he'll strike again." A new danger. The man in Maati. The shadows Miss Marple had known all along that the story wasn't finished. The clues had led her to the right place, but there had always been an undercurrent of danger, a shadow that had loomed just out of reach. Now, with Mrs. Richardson's confession, that shadow had a name, a face, and a far more insidious purpose than she had imagined. She turned toward the door, her mind already calculating the next steps. "We need to warn the others, Mrs. Richardson. We need to expose this man, and we need to do it quickly." "But how?" Mrs. Richardson asked, her voice filled with dread. "He's been here longer than we realize, and if he's been pulling the strings all along—" Miss Marple turned back to her, her expression resolute. "We'll need to find him, expose him for what he truly is. The truth is always the strongest weapon, Mrs. Richardson. You've told me what you know, and now it's time for us to put the pieces together. Once we do, we can stop him." As Miss Marple stepped out of the village hall, her mind was already piecing together the last puzzle piece. The mystery that had plagued St. Mary's Hollow wasn't over, not by a long shot. The man who had orchestrated everything from the shadows was still out there, waiting to strike. But Miss Marple was ready, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth would emerge and justice would finally be served. The game, it seemed, was far from finished, and Miss Marple would not rest until every last secret was uncovered. The weight of Mrs. Richardson's confession pressed heavily on Miss Marple as she made her way through the quiet streets of St. Mary's Hollow. The truth had shifted once more, revealing an unseen danger lurking just beyond the village's picturesque charm. This was no longer a simple case of blackmail and murder. It was a much deeper conspiracy, one that had remained hidden for far too long. The identity of the man who had worked with Grafton, the shadow who had been orchestrating events from behind the scenes, was still unclear. But Miss Marple had her suspicions, and now, more than ever, she knew that time was of the essence. As she walked, the familiar sights of the village felt slightly different. The quaint cottages, the winding lanes, the little shops, all of it seemed somehow overshadowed by the weight of what had transpired. The villagers continued to go about their daily routines, unaware that the dark forces they had unknowingly harbored were still a threat. Miss Marple was determined to stop it before any more lives were lost. She had to act quickly. Grafton's accomplice, whoever he was, could be anywhere. And from what Mrs. Richardson had said, he was no stranger to the village. This man knew the layout of the town, its people, and their habits. He could be hiding in plain sight, slipping unnoticed among the villagers as they went about their daily lives. It was Miss Marple's job to find him, to expose him before he had the chance to strike again. The strategy. A subtle approach. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the flickering fire casting shadows on the walls. She had taken her time thinking through the next steps. The key to solving this part of the mystery wasn't brute force. It was subtlety. Grafton's accomplice was someone who had been playing a game of shadows, manipulating others without ever stepping into the light. To catch him, Miss Marple would have to become just as elusive. She began by considering the people Grafton and his accomplice might have come into contact with upon arriving in St. Mary's Hollow. The village was small enough that everyone knew everyone else, but there were always newcomers who kept to themselves. Who had Grafton and his accomplice met when they arrived? Who had they interacted with? Miss Marple needed to find connections that others might have overlooked. The village was still reeling from the shock of Grafton's death, but Miss Marple knew the villagers were beginning to resume their lives. Some had returned to their usual activities, while others remained in quiet mourning. The village, in its own way, was trying to heal. But Miss Marple understood that the wounds could not fully heal until the last thread of the mystery had been untangled. The first lead. The quiet stranger. Miss Marple decided to begin with one of the most inconspicuous places in the village, the small local pub. The pub had always been a gathering place for villagers, those seeking news, gossip, or simply a quiet drink at the end of the day. It was here that people let down their guards and shared their stories. If anyone knew something about the strange man who had appeared alongside Grafton, it would likely be here. She arrived in the late afternoon, just as the first few customers trickled into the pub. The warm glow from the lanterns inside reflected off the cobblestone streets, and the faint clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation drifted out as the door creaked open. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. The pub was busy, but not overly crowded. The usual patrons were seated at their tables, some chatting, others lost in their own thoughts. Miss Marple's eyes immediately fixed on a man sitting alone at the bar, a man who looked out of place. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features that were set in a permanent expression of cold detachment. He had the look of someone who was always observing, always calculating, and he was watching the room, his gaze flicking from person to person. Miss Marple knew instinctively that this man was connected to the mystery. She had seen that kind of coldness before in people who were hiding something. The key now was to approach him without raising suspicion, to engage him in a conversation that would reveal more than he intended. She made her way to the bar, seating herself at the far end, just a few stools away from the stranger. The bartender, a stout man with a gruff demeanor, poured Miss Marple a glass of water, giving her a nod of recognition. She returned the gesture with a smile, taking a sip of the cool drink as she subtly observed the stranger from the corner of her eye. It didn't take long for the man to notice her. He shifted slightly on his stool, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She knew he was trying to figure her out, just as she was doing with him. "Can I help you, miss?" the man finally asked, his voice low and measured. Miss Marple smiled warmly, turning her full attention to him. "I'm just enjoying the evening, thank you," she said. "It's a lovely pub you have here. I don't come by often, but when I do, I always enjoy the atmosphere." The man's expression softened slightly, but there was still something guarded in his gaze. "You're new around here, aren't you?" he asked, his tone casual, though Miss Marple could tell he was trying to keep the conversation light. "I suppose I am," Miss Marple replied, maintaining the casual tone. "I've lived in St. Mary's Hollow for quite some time, but it's been a while since I visited the pub. You see, I'm a bit of a homebody." The man chuckled softly. "Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes the quiet life is the best life." He took a slow sip from his glass, then turned his attention back to her. "What brings you here today?" Miss Marple smiled inwardly, knowing she had successfully steered the conversation to a point where she could probe further. "Oh, I'm just interested in getting to know the people in the village better. I've noticed that many newcomers pass through St. Mary's Hollow, but they don't always stay long. I suppose it can be difficult for outsiders to find their place in such a small town." The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw something, an almost imperceptible shift in his expression, as if her words had struck a chord. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, his voice more guarded now. "I've been here long enough." Miss Marple didn't push any further, not yet. Instead, she let the conversation drift, maintaining her friendly demeanor while keeping her eyes sharp. The man's nervousness was telling, and she knew she had struck a nerve. The key was to keep him talking, to find out what exactly he was hiding. But just as she was about to ask another question, a man entered the pub, his gait hurried, his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple recognized him immediately. It was Constable Foster. His presence here was no coincidence. He had clearly come to speak with someone, and Miss Marple had a feeling that this encounter wasn't as coincidental as it seemed. The quiet stranger stiffened as he saw Foster, and Miss Marple knew, with a surge of certainty, that this man was the final piece of the puzzle. As Foster made his way toward the bar, Miss Marple turned to the stranger, her voice softer now. "I think you know what I'm talking about," she said, her tone firm and final. The man didn't respond. But his eyes betrayed him, and Miss Marple knew that the time had come to expose the last of the shadows that had plagued St. Mary's Hollow. The final mystery was unraveling, and all it took was one conversation to bring the truth to light. Miss Marple's words hung in the air, as heavy and silent as the room around her. The quiet stranger at the bar shifted uncomfortably on his stool, his eyes flicking nervously toward Constable Foster, who had just entered the pub. The atmosphere in the room seemed to change, the light chatter of the other patrons dying down as the tension between the three of them thickened. The constable, who had entered with his usual calm demeanor, seemed to notice the shift. His eyes immediately locked onto Miss Marple, and he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. They had been in this game together before, and Miss Marple knew that Foster trusted her instincts. The stranger, however, was another matter. He had been trying so carefully to stay beneath the radar, and now, with the unexpected arrival of Foster, the walls he had built around himself were crumbling. He wasn't accustomed to being confronted, and Miss Marple, for all her calm exterior, could see the cracks forming. Foster stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, then resting on the stranger. "Everything all right here, sir?" he asked, his voice friendly but firm. He knew exactly what was happening. The stranger hesitated. Before responding, his voice tight with the tension he was trying so hard to suppress. "I'm just having a drink," he said, offering a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing to worry about." Miss Marple, sensing the opportunity, smiled back at him with a kind but knowing expression. "It's always good to enjoy the simple pleasures of life," she said, her tone light but her gaze never leaving his face. "Especially when one is trying to stay unnoticed in a small village." The stranger shifted again, his jaw tightening slightly. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice carrying an edge of defensiveness. Miss Marple glanced over at Constable Foster, who seemed to take in every detail of the exchange. He didn't speak, but his expression was one of quiet resolve. He was ready, as always, to follow Miss Marple's lead. Miss Marple turned back to the stranger, her tone soft but unyielding. "I think you do know what I mean," she said gently. "You see, this village isn't quite as quiet as it seems. People notice things. They remember faces. And they remember strange visitors." The stranger's face stiffened, and Miss Marple could feel the pulse of tension in the room. He was on the edge now, and she could see it. He had no more patience for pleasantries, and he was ready to snap. "You've been working with Grafton, haven't you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady and calm, but with an underlying sharpness. "The man you've been trying so desperately to stay hidden from. You thought his death would cover everything up, but it hasn't, has it?" The stranger's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was the smallest thing, but it was enough. She had pushed him to the brink, and now there was no escape. Foster stepped closer, his presence unmistakable. "We've had enough of the games, sir," he said firmly. "It's time to come clean. Who are you, really?" The stranger's gaze flicked between Miss Marple and Foster, and for a moment, the pub seemed to hold its breath. The man, who had been so careful in concealing his identity, seemed to realize that there was no more running. The walls had finally closed in on him. With a sharp exhale, he slumped back in his seat, his shoulders sagging in resignation. "You're right," he muttered. "I wasn't expecting you to figure it out. I thought I had been careful, but I underestimated you." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Underestimated? You've been playing a very dangerous game, haven't you?" The stranger looked up, his eyes cold and distant. "Dangerous? You have no idea what you've gotten yourselves into. You should have left it alone." Grafton was just the beginning. The real plan. The real purpose behind all of this wasn't just about blackmail. It was about control. Foster leaned in, his expression hardening. "Control? What do you mean by that?" The stranger met his gaze, his voice low but steady. Grafton was a means to an end. He and I had been working together for years, but it wasn't just about money or power. It was about destabilizing everything, pulling the strings behind the scenes, making people afraid. You see, it wasn't just Mrs. Richardson he was threatening. He was threatening all of you, everyone in this village. Miss Marple felt a chill creep up her spine. You wanted to tear the village apart, but why? What was the endgame? The stranger's lips twitched into a faint, cynical smile. The endgame, Miss Marple, was control. Control over the village, control over the people in it. Grafton and I wanted to show the world that the past could always come back to haunt you. We wanted to break everyone's trust, to show that no one was truly safe. That's what he had on all of you. Miss Marple's eyes widened as the full extent of the plan began to unfold. You wanted to destroy the fabric of this community. You thought that by turning people against each other, you could take over, control it all from the shadows. The stranger nodded, his expression cold. Exactly. And you nearly stopped us, Miss Marple. You and the constable. You've been a thorn in our side. But we were careful. We made sure that the right pieces fell into place at the right time. Foster stepped forward, his voice hard. Who else was involved? Who was behind Grafton's plan? You're not the only one here. The stranger hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door as if weighing his options. Finally, he looked back at them, a look of resolve settling on his face. I'm not going to name names. I've already said too much. But you'll find them if you dig deep enough. They're still out there, watching. Miss Marple took a step closer, her expression unyielding. And you? What happens to you now? The stranger leaned back, his eyes narrowing. I'll face the consequences, just like everyone else. But this isn't over, Miss Marple. You might have solved one mystery, but there's always another. Waiting. That's the way of things. He rose from his stool slowly, his eyes flicking toward the door one last time, before turning back to Miss Marple and Constable Foster. The shadows may have receded, but the game never ends. You'll see. As he walked toward the door, Miss Marple stood still, watching him leave. She felt the finality of the moment, the ending of one chapter, the beginning of another. But there was still so much more to uncover, so much left unsaid. The village had been changed, yes, but the larger game was far from over. A new beginning. The unanswered questions. The stranger's departure left a lingering sense of unease in the room. The mystery had been cracked open, but its edges were still ragged. Miss Marple knew this was just another beginning, another chapter in the ongoing story of human nature's darker corners. Foster glanced at her, his expression troubled. So that's it then? Miss Marple nodded slowly. For now, Constable. For now. But as I've always said, there's never truly an end to these things. The truth will always find its way to the surface. Foster sighed, his shoulders sagging in exhaustion. I never thought a quiet village like this would harbor such danger. Danger doesn't always announce itself, Constable, Miss Marple said with a wry smile. Sometimes it's hidden beneath the most ordinary of facades. But that's why we must always be alert. There's always something more to find. As they both stood there watching the last of the evening light fade from the sky, Miss Marple knew that the village would heal. The shadows had been exposed, and now it was time for the light to shine once more. But she also knew that the quiet would never be quite the same again. And in her heart, she was ready for whatever came next. The game was far from over. The days following the revelation in the pub were quieter than expected. The village of St. Mary's Hollow, though shaken by the tumultuous events that had unfolded over the past few weeks, seemed to return to its regular rhythm. Yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was merely an illusion, a lull before the storm. She had always known that there was more to the story than what had been revealed so far. Though the immediate danger had passed with the exposure of Grafton's accomplice, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel the weight of unfinished business. The village had been saved from one threat, but there were still pieces of the puzzle left scattered in the wind, pieces that might explain how deep the conspiracy had really run and how many others were involved. The mystery had been solved, in a sense, But the threads were still unraveling in the back of her mind. She needed answers, not only for herself but for the people of St. Mary's Hollow. The village deserved to know the full extent of what had happened. But where to begin? A quiet conversation with Constable Foster. Pieces of the past. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, had spent several days allowing the events to settle. She had walked the village paths, observed the residents going about their business, and listened to the gentle hum of gossip as the story of Grafton and the unknown man's arrest gradually faded into the background. Still, she knew there was something more lurking in the shadows. It was during a quiet walk to the constable's office that she felt an unmistakable sense of resolve. Constable Foster had been a quiet but ever-present ally throughout the investigation. She could sense that he too was haunted by unanswered questions. He had made considerable progress in his work, but he had yet to fully grasp the depths of the conspiracy. As she arrived at the constable's office, she saw Foster sitting at his desk, scribbling notes in his usual methodical way. He looked up as she entered, his face pale and drawn. The events had taken a toll on him, no doubt, but there was something else in his gaze, a quiet resolve, a growing recognition that there was still more to uncover. "Miss Marple," he said with a weary smile, "I wasn't expecting you today. I thought we were done with all this." "Finished?" Miss Marple repeated with a soft chuckle, settling into the chair across from him. "Oh, Constable, I fear that we are never truly finished with mysteries, especially not the kind that go so deep." Foster's smile faded slightly, and he sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're right, I've been thinking about it all too. The more I reflect on it, the more I realize that we've only scratched the surface." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly. We solved the immediate puzzle, but there are still pieces of the past we have yet to uncover. And we must face the reality that some of those pieces may reveal things that none of us are ready to confront." Foster looked at her, confusion furrowing his brow. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? I thought we knew everything about Grafton's accomplice. We have his confession. We know about the blackmail. That's it, isn't it?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You've done well, Constable. You've worked hard. But what you don't yet know is that this man, this accomplice of Grafton's, wasn't acting alone. There's more at play here, more people involved, more layers of deception. What if we've been so focused on Grafton's direct manipulation of Mrs. Richardson that we overlooked the bigger picture?" Foster leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing as the implications of Miss Marple's words sank in. "You think there's more to it? More people involved?" "I do," Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with both certainty and caution. What if Grafton's blackmail scheme wasn't just about getting money from the village's elite? What if he was trying to control something far larger, something that none of us had even considered? Foster stared at her for a long moment, his gaze clouded with thought. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "You think Grafton was trying to take control of the village itself? That he wanted power over the people here? But why?" "Exactly. Constable. Why?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift in her mind. "It doesn't make sense, does it? Why would someone like Grafton, with his sharp mind and sophisticated demeanor, bother with a quiet village like this? There's something more that we're missing." A hidden agenda. The bigger picture. Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she considered the new direction of their investigation. The events had become so tangled, so intricately connected, that it was hard to see the bigger picture. The village, which seemed so peaceful, was now the center of a much larger and far more sinister game. The blackmail, the threats, the murders, they were all connected to something deeper. But what? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the clearer the answer became. Grafton hadn't been just a man trying to manipulate the lives of a few villagers for personal gain. No, he had been attempting to break the village's very foundation. He had wanted to destabilize the community. An attempt at control, yes, but also a way to create chaos and fear. He wanted to weaken the village from the inside out. "Grafton didn't just want money, Constable," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady with realization. "Realization," she whispered. I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted control. Just enough to keep my life from falling apart. But I see now that I've caused more harm than I could have ever imagined. Miss Marple's voice softened as she looked at the woman who had been so desperate to protect her secrets. It's not too late to make things right, Mrs. Richardson. But you must face the truth now for the sake of the village. For the first time, Mrs. Richardson broke down, tears filling her eyes as she collapsed into a chair. I didn't mean for any of this, she sobbed. I never meant for anyone to die, but I didn't know how to stop. Foster stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. The truth always comes out, Mrs. Richardson, and now it's time to face the consequences. As Miss Marple watched, she knew that the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The village could begin to heal now. And though the scars of the past would never fully disappear, the truth had finally been exposed and justice would be served. The game, as it turned out, had never been about winning. It had always been about understanding. And for Miss Marple, understanding was the greatest victory of all. The days that followed Mrs. Richardson's confession were somber ones for the village of St. Mary's Hollow. The once quiet community, so often hidden beneath layers of time and tradition, had been irrevocably altered. The villagers, though they had long prided themselves on their unity and serenity, now found themselves looking over their shoulders, their relationships strained by the revelations that had shattered the peace they had long taken for granted. Miss Marple, ever observant, had noticed the subtle shifts in behavior. People who had once exchanged pleasantries with each other now found themselves avoiding eye contact. Conversations that once revolved around the weather or local events now seemed strained, as if the undercurrents of suspicion and guilt had tainted the very air. Some of the villagers even began to leave the pub earlier than usual or linger in their homes, the silence louder than any words they could say. It was clear that the village would take time to heal, if it could at all. The revelations that had come to light, though necessary, had not only uncovered the truth about the deaths of Charles Grafton and Margaret Dell, but had also exposed the darkness lying just beneath the surface of the community. Trust had been broken, and it wasn't something that could be repaired easily. Yet, for all the discomfort and unease, Miss Marple could not help but feel a certain satisfaction. She had known all along that there was more to this story than met the eye. Grafton's death had been only one piece of a larger puzzle, one that involved manipulation, blackmail, and secrets buried deep in the past. But now, the truth had been unveiled, and though it had brought pain and discomfort, it was a necessary step for the village's future. A quiet visit. Mrs. Richardson's departure. It was late in the afternoon when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. The small knock on her door was gentle, almost hesitant, and when she opened it, she found Mrs. Richardson standing on her doorstep. The chairwoman, once so composed and full of authority, now appeared small and fragile in the fading light. Her face was pale, her eyes red from what Miss Marple could only assume were days of weeping. There was an air of finality about her presence, something Miss Marple immediately recognized. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Richardson said softly, her voice steady but faint, as if it took all her strength to speak. "I need to speak with you, if you have a moment." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her in, gesturing toward the armchair by the fire. "Of course, Mrs. Richardson, please make yourself comfortable." The chairwoman sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, as though she were holding herself together with sheer will. Miss Marple remained standing for a moment, watching. Her waiting. Finally, Mrs. Richardson spoke again, her voice heavy with the weight of unspoken words. "I've made a decision," she said, looking up at Miss Marple with a mixture of resolve and sorrow. "I can't stay here any longer. The village is no longer the place I knew. I don't belong here anymore." Miss Marple, ever patient, nodded. "I understand, Mrs. Richardson. This village has been through a great deal in the past few weeks, and it's changed us all. But you must remember that no matter where you go, you cannot outrun the past. It's always with us, shaping who we are whether we want it to or not." Mrs. Richardson gave a small, weary smile. "I know that, but I need to try. I need to go somewhere far away, somewhere I can start over, perhaps find some semblance of peace, For my sake. And for the village's. Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. I believe you're right. You've been carrying a heavy burden, and you face the consequences of your actions. I can only hope that this new chapter will bring you the peace you seek. The chairwoman's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she managed a nod of gratitude. I'm sorry, Miss Marple, for all the pain I caused, for the lies I told. I never meant for any of it to happen. You've confessed and you've taken responsibility, Miss Marple said gently. Now it's time for you to forgive yourself. You've done what you could for the village, and now you must do what's best for you. The new beginning. Life after the storm. The days after Mrs. Richardson's departure felt strange. There was a finality to it all, as if the village were a ship that had lost its anchor and was drifting aimlessly, unsure of its next destination. Yet, in the absence of the chairwoman's influence, the villagers seemed to grow quieter still. The town square, once a bustling place of commerce and conversation, now felt almost desolate. People went about their business with their heads down, avoiding one another's eyes. But Miss Marple, as always, saw more than just the surface. There was a shift happening, small, subtle, but it was happening nonetheless. The village was beginning to breathe again, slowly but surely. It was tentative, almost as if they feared the peace wouldn't last. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Peace, after all, was something one earned, and St. Mary's Hollow had earned its quiet after the storm. She spent the next few days walking through the village, taking note of the small changes. A woman who had once been a stranger to Miss Marple now nodded a quiet greeting as she passed. The baker's wife, who had kept her distance in the wake of the revelations, now greeted Miss Marple with a soft smile. There was something healing in those small moments, a tentative return to the familiar rhythms of village life. And then, as Miss Marple walked past the familiar garden gate of her own cottage, she saw him, the young man who had recently taken up residence in the village. His name was James Heath, a quiet, unassuming figure who had recently come to live in St. Mary's Hollow. At first, Miss Marple had suspected little about him, but something in the way he stood watching the village from his garden gave her pause. Good afternoon, Miss Marple, he called out, tipping his hat with a polite smile. Afternoon, Mr. Heath, Miss Marple replied, giving him a courteous nod. How are you settling in? He looked at her for a moment, as though debating whether to say something. I've found it. Peaceful here, he said finally. The past few weeks must have been difficult for the village. I didn't realize how deeply the shadows could run. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes noting the way his expression flickered, just briefly, before he masked it. Yes, it's been a trying time, she replied, her tone neutral but watchful. But perhaps the storm has passed, and now the village can begin again. He smiled, though there was something in his eyes that Miss Marple couldn't quite read. I hope so, he said softly, glancing back toward the garden. I've heard a great deal about what happened, but there's always more to a story, isn't there? Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, her mind working behind her placid expression. She had always trusted her instincts, and something about Mr. Heath, something in the way he spoke, the undertone in his words, struck her as curious. His sudden arrival, his choice to settle in a village so rife with recent scandal, felt calculated. There was more here than he was letting on. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice shifting slightly as she gave him a polite smile. And some stories remain untold. As she walked away, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that her suspicions were only just beginning. The village, still recovering from the whirlwind of recent revelations, may have found its calm. But Miss Marple knew that peace was never permanent, especially not in a place so full of secrets. The game had changed, but Miss Marple knew there would always be more mysteries to unravel, and she would be ready. The game never ends. The quiet return. The village of St. Mary's Hollow was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. The residents, though still wary, were finding their way back to the small joys of daily life. The once ominous shadows that had hung over the village had lifted, but Miss Marple knew better than to believe that the storm was over. There was always more, always something hidden beneath the surface. And as always, Miss Marple would be there to uncover it, The game had not ended, it had only begun again. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the quiet evening settled in, Miss Marple stood in her garden, gazing out at the peaceful village. The wind rustled the leaves gently, and for a moment, she allowed herself a rare breath of tranquility. But only for a moment. Tomorrow would bring a new mystery, and Miss Marple would be ready. He wanted to expose the darkest corners of everyone's lives, to show that no one was above suspicion, that everyone had secrets. His real goal was to fracture the village's unity, to make everyone question one another, to break the trust that held the community together. Foster's face grew pale. You mean he was trying to tear us apart? To destroy the foundation of this village? Exactly, Miss Marple said. But here's the key. We've been so focused on Grafton's death and his accomplice that we haven't asked the right question. Who was Grafton really working for? Who stood to gain from all this destruction? The silence in the room grew heavy as Foster absorbed her words. You mean there's someone else behind this? Someone we haven't considered? Miss Marple nodded slowly. There must be. Grafton was a pawn in a much larger game, Constable. And whoever was behind him had an agenda we still don't understand. It wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about power and control. The final discovery. Connecting the dots. Miss Marple's words hung in the air, the final puzzle piece slipping into place. She and Constable Foster had been missing something fundamental. The story of Grafton, his accomplice, and the village's tangled web was only part of the equation. The true mastermind, the person who had orchestrated everything from the shadows, was still out there, pulling the strings. Foster's expression hardened as the realization set in. You're right, he said slowly. There's someone else, someone we haven't caught. But how do we find them? Miss Marple smiled, a glimmer of determination in her eyes. We need to go back to the beginning. We need to look at everyone Grafton interacted with in this village. Who had the most to gain from this chaos? Who could afford to see everything torn apart? Constable Foster's eyes narrowed in understanding. We'll start with the people closest to Grafton, the ones who had everything to lose. But Miss Marple, do you think we're running out of time? If someone's pulling the strings, they could be planning something else right now. We are running out of time, Miss Marple said. But we've been patient long enough. The truth is closer than we think. The final pieces were falling into place. There was no more guessing, no more theory. They had to act, and act quickly. Miss Marple and Constable Foster were on the brink of discovering the true mastermind behind everything. But the clock was ticking, and the game was far from over. The air in St. Mary's Hollow was thick with uncertainty. Despite the efforts of Constable Foster and Miss Marple to bring clarity to the string of mysterious deaths and manipulations that had shaken the village to its core, the shadows of the past still lingered. There was no true peace yet, not for Miss Marple, not for the villagers, and certainly not for the mastermind who had orchestrated the chaos from the very beginning. The evening was closing in, and as Miss Marple walked with Constable Foster toward the village square, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were drawing closer to something crucial, something that would finally reveal who stood behind the curtain, pulling the strings of this deadly game. I've been thinking about what you said, Foster began, breaking the silence between them. About Grafton's accomplice, the one who was manipulating everything. It all makes sense now. But we're missing one thing. Who could have had the most to gain from Grafton's destruction? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she considered his words. The truth was, she had already started to form a clearer picture. Grafton hadn't been working alone. He was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The pieces were scattered, and it was time to connect them all. We've been looking at the wrong people, Miss Marple finally said, her voice sharp with realization. Grafton was only the instrument, not the mastermind. He wasn't pulling the strings. There's someone else, someone who has been playing the long game all along. Foster's brow furrowed. Someone we haven't suspected? Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice low but firm. It's not just about who had the most to gain from Grafton's destruction. It's about the person who could stand to gain from the dissolution of everything the village holds dear. A forgotten connection, Mrs. Richardson's unseen role. The answer seemed so clear in that moment. The village, for all its charm, had always been a haven for people seeking escape, whether from the pressures of city life or, as Miss Marple had come to realize, from the consequences of past sins. It was the kind of place where the past could be buried, forgotten, and left to fester in silence. But when it came to Mrs. Richardson, something was amiss. Her deep ties to the village's history and her connection to Grafton had always struck Miss Marple as too coincidental. As Miss Marple and Foster continued their walk through the village, she thought of Mrs. Richardson's role in the unfolding drama. Grafton had come to the village, not just to torment her, but to expose the secrets she had so carefully kept hidden. But there was more to Mrs. Richardson's story than anyone had realized. She wasn't just a victim of blackmail, she had been a part of the larger scheme, a scheme that extended far beyond her own personal fears. Miss Marple stopped in her tracks, a sudden realization dawning on her. Foster, it's her. It's always been her. Mrs. Richardson? Foster asked, clearly perplexed. Yes, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. She isn't just a victim, she's the key to everything. We've been focusing on the wrong things. The blackmail, the murders, Grafton's manipulations, but the real mastermind was right in front of us all along. Foster stared at her, his confusion slowly turning to understanding. Are you saying Mrs. Richardson was behind it all? But how? Think, Constable, Miss Marple said. The village was a place for people to escape, fleeing from their pasts. Mrs. Richardson has lived here for years, but she never fully embraced the life she tried to create. She kept a foot in both worlds. Her past, her involvement with Grafton. It all connects. She wanted control. Control over the village, control over the people in it. She thought that by controlling Grafton's blackmail, she could keep the village under her influence, quietly pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Foster's eyes widened. But why? What did she have to gain? She was afraid, Miss Marple replied simply. Afraid of being exposed, of having her past come to light. She believed that if she could control the chaos Grafton created, she could keep everything stable, her position, her life, her future. But in trying to protect herself, she ended up pushing things too far. She played the game, hoping to win, but it cost lives. Foster was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. You're right. She was involved in everything, every part of the plan. I never saw it, but now, it makes sense. It was her desperation to keep the village under her control that made Grafton's arrival possible. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. And it wasn't just the blackmail that drove her to act. It was her desire to manipulate everything. She used Grafton, used his threats to make sure the village stayed in line. Only when Margaret started asking questions did things spiral out of control. The final confrontation. The truth unveiled. With the truth now clear in her mind, Miss Marple knew it was time to confront Mrs. Richardson, to bring everything to a head. She and Foster made their way back to the village hall, where Mrs. Richardson was likely to be. The village was quiet now, the last of the evening light, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. The weight of the past had finally caught up to the village, and the final confrontation loomed large. As they entered the hall, Miss Marple's gaze swept over the familiar surroundings. The tables, the chairs, the stage where countless community events had taken place. All of it seemed so mundane now, so ordinary. Yet beneath the surface, everything had changed. The quiet, picturesque life that the villagers had taken for granted was now shattered. Mrs. Richardson sat by the fire, as she had done countless times before, her hands folded in her lap. She was the picture of composure, her face an expression of calm that Miss Marple knew too well. It was the calm of someone who had learned to mask their true feelings, to hide their guilt beneath a veneer of civility. Mrs. Richardson, Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness of the room. We need to talk. The chairwoman looked up, her expression hardening for a moment before she spoke. Miss Marple, I suppose I knew this moment was coming. You've been hiding the truth for far too long, Mrs. Richardson, Miss Marple continued, stepping forward. It's time to stop pretending. Mrs. Richardson's eyes flickered with something unreadable. For a moment, Miss Marple saw the faintest trace of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly masked. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cool, but the edge of nervousness creeping through. "Of course you do," Miss Marple replied. "You've been pulling the strings from the start. Grafton didn't come here to simply torment you. He came to expose everything, your connections, your role in the past. And when Margaret began to ask questions, you saw your control slipping away. So you pushed him further, pushed him to expose everyone. And when it became too much, you let things spiral." The color drained from Mrs. Richardson's face as the truth settled into the room like a heavy weight. Her hands trembled as she stood, facing Miss Marple and Foster. "I didn't want it to go this far.